Alright, we're continuing in section 2 of chapter 15. This segment, we're going to deal with the different religions that started in China or that became very popular in China. The first one is Confucianism. Confucianism was started and named after a person named Confucius, pictured here. Confucius is his name, so that's the name of the guy who founded the religion, and it's called Confucianism. Confucius lived during the period of warring states, which means he lived during a time period when there was war going on all the time, which means he lived in a crazy time. And so, because of that, his whole idea about what would make the world a better place is if there wasn't any war and if everything was peaceful. And the way to do that, he thought, was to follow what he called the five relationships. So there are five relationships that he thought were important, that if everybody knew their place and followed these five relationships, then everything would be peaceful. Those five relationships include father over son, and man over woman, and emperor over citizen, and older brother over younger brother, and friend to friend. That's the only one that isn't a situation where one person is over another person. Basically, if you look at Confucianism, it's all about one person having more power than another person, and the person with the most power is supposed to be responsible in using that power and looking out for the person underneath them, kind of like a parent to a child, because father son is one of them. And the person in the other side of the relationship, the person with less power, is supposed to not question the person with the more power and to follow directions and to trust and to always be supportive of the person in the role of responsibility. This leads us to filial piety. This right here, which is an important terminology. Filial piety is that special relationship between father and son, parent and child, but really the Chinese concentrated on men, especially in the traditional times. They really didn't talk about women much at all. So really, it wasn't to all parents, it was just the father. The father had the power. The father, what he said goes. So filial piety has to do with the relationship between father and son or father and child. And the idea between filial piety is that a child should always listen to their parents no matter what. There was no questioning of the parents. There was no, but that's not what I want, or I want to do something different, or I don't feel like it. It was straight, always obeying type of thing. On the flip side of that, of course, the parent, the father, was supposed to always be responsible in making decisions not just because he felt like it, but because they were the best for the family. So that's kind of the whole idea behind filial piety. Very big in Chinese society and culture, still very strong ideas today. Obviously, not a real strong part of American culture. It's very different. Another aspect of that is that family and society, the good of the majority of the population, the group, was more important than the individual. So, for example, what was best for the family was more important than what was best for you as an individual. What was best for the town or the city or the community or the empire was more important than what you wanted. And so there's a lot of repression of individual ideas and of individual thoughts and of individual desires in this particular approach. They were very heavy on education, emphasize on people becoming as well educated as possible, and there was a huge amount of respect for anyone who was educated. People who had higher levels of education were seen as being more important and more powerful than anybody else in society. So people worked hard to become well educated because that's the main way you got respect in that society. The interesting thing about Confucianism is it dominated Chinese society for centuries, and there's still remnants of it around in their traditions and things like that. But basically, the government and everything about Chinese culture was run according to the rules of Confucianism, and there was always this talk about Confucius says this, Confucius says that, and they would quote things from Confucius all the time. So it very prevalent in all of society. Now the next one is Taoism. Taoism was never as powerful as Confucianism as far as controlling society and ideas, but Taoism is still a very strong religious set of ideas in China, especially in the rural areas. And Taoism was founded by a guy named Lao Tzu, so this is his name right here, and this is his picture. And sometimes you will see Taoism spelled with a T. It's the same thing. It just has to do with the pronunciation. Um, and sometimes you'll see Lao Tse's name spelled Lao and then TSE instead of ZI. It's the same guy. So it's just a matter of translating from Chinese, which the Chinese don't use our same letters, so it doesn't always translate the same way. So Taoism wasn't like Confucianism. It wasn't all about rules and following directions and orders and everybody knowing their place. Taoism was about being in tune with nature, is very much focused on being bonded with nature, following the natural element. It calls it following the Tao. The Tao means the way. It's like the way of the universe, the way of what life is. They believed that the less government there was, the better. They believed that actually, if you had absolutely no government, that would be the absolute best, but they weren't totally, I don't know what you want to call it, in dreamland. They realized that probably wasn't ever going to happen because of human nature, that people could never be fully in tune with nature. If they were, they wouldn't need any government. But since they can't be, because no matter how hard you try, some people just are going to be greedy and do stupid things and whatever. So you're going to need some kind of government. But the least amount possible. You try to have as little government as possible. And the interesting thing about Taoism, it's based a lot on mysterious types of things. They talk about the Tao Te Ching, and they talk about the yin and yang symbol, which is kind of popular in some of the artwork and things like that today. People see, you see them using that in symbols and things like that, which comes from Taoism. It's the whole idea of balance. It's based a lot on superstitions and, those kinds of beliefs, things that aren't real solid. But the irony of that is, even though it's based almost entirely on superstitions and those kinds of beliefs, in reality, it led to, because they were so much about observing nature, it actually led to a lot of advances in chemistry and biology, because they were spending a lot of time observing plants and animals and things like that, and the way they lived and the way they interacted. And they actually studied a lot of the plants and developed a lot of medicines and a lot of different remedies and things like that, which are actually, as it turns out, very scientifically based, and they're often still used today in modern forms, based on their study of the plants and things like that in ancient times. So it's actually turned out to be very scientific, even though it's also very much based on superstitions, which is not science at all. The third religious tradition that started in China was something called legalism, which isn't really a religious tradition at all. It's really just a philosophy. And basically, this is sort of the opposite of Taoism in many ways. Taoists believed that people could live in tune with nature and could live in harmony and things like that. A legalist believed that that's not even possible. They said human beings are just naturally evil. They're naturally mean to each other, they're naturally unfair, and they're naturally greedy, and all those kinds of negative things. And that the only way to get people to live in harmony with each other is through like a dictatorship, through force, rewarding those people who do what you want them to do and punishing those people who don't, having very, very strict rules and harsh laws, and just basically forcing everybody to obey them. And legalism was pretty much common in China, but only for one period of time under one ruler, and that's this guy, the Emperor Qin Shi Huang, who is here pictured. Now, Qin Shi Huang was the leader during the Qin Dynasty, and he was all about the legalist approach to things. He was like, forget this other stuff, forget this being in harmony with nature, forget this relationships and rules of Confucianism. In fact, he had books of Confucianism burned and destroyed and things like that. He said, here are the rules, here are the laws, you're going to follow them or else. And in fact, legalists believed so strongly in punishments and things like that and harsh laws that they didn't really even care if someone was actually guilty of something when they were punished, because they just assumed that naturally all humans did evil things. So if you got punished for something that you didn't do, that was all right, because you probably did something else that you got away with and you should have been punished for. So either way, you deserve to be punished. Pretty much everybody deserved to be punished because everybody was just naturally evil and was likely to do things wrong, which probably explains why this was not very popular for very long. Okay? It was effective. It unified the country, but it was not very popular. the last one here is Buddhism. And Buddhism, of course, we know did not start in China. It actually started in India, and it was brought to China by different missionaries, Buddhist monks, and things like that. And the thing about Buddhism is in China, the reason why it became so popular in China is because it filled a gap. None of those other ideas that I mentioned talked anything about the afterlife, didn't talk anything about what happened after you died. They talked about how people should live, what they should do or shouldn't do while they were here, okay, living their lives, how they should interact with each other, interact with nature, that kind of thing. But none of them talked anything about what happened after you died. And so Buddhism talked about this nirvana, this peace, this perfect place of lack of pain and suffering and all this kind of stuff. And the people of China were like, that is some cool stuff. We like that concept. The interesting thing about this was that they could continue to follow their Confucian ideas, or even their Taoist ideas, or any other ideas, and just add Buddhism in. They didn't have to replace their old ideas with Buddhist ideas. They could just add the Buddhist ideas on, which is another reason why it was so popular. You could go ahead and still follow all your Confucian traditions about men and women and parents and children or whatever, and also be Buddhist, and also worship these Buddhist figures and believe in an afterlife and meditate and follow a Buddhist way of life as well. So that's what a lot of people did. And the other thing is, of course, that it became very diverse. Different people applied Buddhism in different ways. I mean, we saw that just in the different statues. You see the statues of Buddha that came out of China. I mean, what did they do to the poor guy? They made him obese, and he was never that way in any of the perceptions of the Indian people. But the Chinese were different people, and they looked at Buddhism in different ways, and they just kind of made it fit to what they wanted it to be. So that was something kind of unique there. All right, that's where we're going to stop.